All righty. Hey, I'd like to welcome everyone to the 26th DEM I Wonder Webinar. DEM has so many services, offerings, programs, and hidden gems we want to share with all of you. So we're excited to take just a few minutes each week to highlight these features in our weekly webinar. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, many exercises have been postponed or canceled. The Utah Division of Emergency Management is hosting this weekly webinar series aimed at providing local emergency managers with relevant content and an opportunity to enhance their capabilities. Webinars are live for Q&A and are recorded for later viewing on DEM websites and YouTube channel. Most of these webinars are seminars or workshops with hands-on portions which will allow emergency managers to become oriented to a DEM process or test a DEM product. Our schedule today will be as follows. We'll start with our ground rules and etiquette. Next, we'll have a brief presentation by Tanner Patterson on I Wonder, what is disaster financial management? Following the presentation, the presenter will be available for a Q&A session. Following the Q&A, we will close with a short message about upcoming webinars. The ground rules today are fairly simple. Please mute your line while the presenter is presenting. If you have a question, you may type it in the group chat or unmute at the appropriate time to ask your question. This session is being recorded and will be available on our website for future viewing. Thank you all for your attendance today. With that, Tanner, we'll turn the time over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jeff.
You're welcome.
So I'm Tanner Patterson. I am the finance manager for the Division of Emergency Management. And today I'm going to present on disaster financial management. So, disaster financial management. And I am speaking from like one portion of this. This is a topic that you can get very much into the weeds of. So really I'm presenting basically the idea of disaster financial management. Looks different everywhere. It's just these are things that you might not have thought of that come up in disasters. So that's kind of the direction of this presentation. And to kick it off, what is financial disaster management? So financial disaster management is a set of considerations and practices necessary to track, calculate, and justify the cost of an emergency, support reimbursement reconciliation, avoid deobligation of grant funding, and effectively fund and implement recovery projects and priorities. So having a disaster management plan in place ahead of a disaster will save a lot of headaches. We definitely learned with COVID, the earthquake, the windstorm, all the things that have happened. Even with a disaster management plan, there are just a lot of things that you might not think about that months after, a year after a disaster can make something on the financial and the documentation side more difficult. So having that plan in place ahead of time will save a lot of backtracking and headaches down the road. And I do want to emphasize on this. So financial disaster management and recovery play into each other a lot. But this presentation isn't really about recovery, but it'll come up a lot because that's one of the probably most significant factors. Like they both rely on each other a ton. So a financial disaster management team and the composition of that team. So typically, and this is a best practice, for a financial disaster management team, you'll have the emergency managers, recovery managers, finance managers, and grant managers. A lot of times you'll see these as sometimes all four of these people, or rather the kind of the skill sets and the responsibilities of these people being filled by one person. And definitely a lot for one person. So like I said, like this is the best practice. It could even be bigger than this, but definitely can't recommend less than this in DEM specifically. So we have the emergency managers, which is pretty much anybody responding and carrying out missions. The recovery managers here, that's Jana. I'm the finance manager. And then we have our grant managers, which is Jana's section assigned to specific projects under PA and other grant programs. But like I said, recovery is going to come up a lot in this one. So that's kind of number one. That's the first thing that I think is really important to talk about locally, within your agencies, within your department, however broad the conversation needs to be. Maybe not these positions, but these skill sets need to be represented in a financial disaster management team. And ideally, they're held by different people, because otherwise you're going to be juggling a lot of things at once, because all of these things are happening oftentimes at the same time. So disaster financial management activities are split up into 3 phases. And this is everything that I'm talking about is actually from a guide that I'll talk about at the end of the presentation. But it's the pre-disaster activities, initial post-disaster activities, longer-term post-disaster activities. Pre-disaster being basically before anything happens, trying to anticipate for things, have SOPs and those practices and procedures set up ahead of needing them. The initial post-disaster, which I feel like the name can kind of be misunderstood, this is just right after the disaster happens. So this can also be synonymous with basically during the response. And then longer term post-disaster activities, they come after the incident is closed. You're trying to tie a bow on all the financial considerations that that emergency brought along with it. So pre-disaster activities, and this is a short list. The list in the guide is much longer. I took the bullet points that I felt were the most relevant to the group that I'd be presenting to. And this is just things for consideration and the types of things to think about so that you can take this back to your home agencies and, consider, are we prepared for these things? Do we have these things? Some of these are on more of a macro scale than a micro scale. For instance, this one, so complete and maintain a FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan. So that wouldn't happen like within each agency, but each political subdivision, however it's structured. So a hazard mitigation plan, it is required to qualify for HMGP, FMA, and the BRIC programs. And states, so our state plan is required for us to qualify for some categories of public assistance. Implement emergency contracting mechanisms and contracts. This is a very big one. So developing these mechanisms, especially ahead of time, help them to not be a impediment when you are responding to the disaster. Typically, most procurement policies will have things in place for obviously regular contracting, but then even sole source contracting. But sole source contracting is not synonymous with emergency procurement or anything like that. It's a very specific process that, while faster than an RFP, will still slow things down. So having the mechanisms in place for emergency procurement, it's not just go out and buy whatever you want, but it is a process where you can expedite procurement during an emergency. Create an annual reserve disaster spending fund account. So this is one that's gotten a lot of use recently here at the state. So we have the state disaster recovery account, and it's basically during a disaster you're going to have a lot of unanticipated costs, and if you don't have that fund created that you can have those expenses charged to, with or without potential federal reimbursement, those funds might end up in a general fund. They might throw a budget completely out of whack because there's nowhere else to cover them. So yeah, we couldn't recommend this one strong enough. Have that disaster spending fund. So initial post-disaster. So right after the disaster happens. So we want to conduct preliminary damage assessments for potential declaration. This one I'm not going to go into too much. Jana actually did an I Wonder webinar on this very specific topic, and it's very informative as to what role that plays on the financial side of a disaster response. So activate and use disaster accounting general ledger lines, cost tracking. This one is huge for me, especially with COVID and all the things going on at the same time. Setting up cost tracking mechanisms to be able to filter your ledger and basically see what your expenses were, rather than just having them all be in one giant pot. And then when you're going and trying to get reimbursement, you have to sift through them and figure out which ones were tied to which activities, which missions, which disasters. Log and track time and expenses. This one I threw in here because it has been one of the more difficult items. The requirements under public assistance for force account labor reimbursement are pretty extreme, and a lot of payroll systems don't have all of the tools that would be needed to track this within that payroll system. So you do have to have a plan in place for how you're going to get that additional information. It can be from the incident action plan, as long as the incident action plan is collecting the information that you need on the participants. There's a lot of ways to do this, but logging and tracking time is worth paying extra attention to. So activate your emergency procurement and contracts as needed. So this ties into those contracting mechanisms that I talked about before. And actually, I'm going to take a step back, because in addition to that is emergency contracts, having contracts that you can basically have everything, all the groundwork laid ahead of a disaster happening, knowing these are the contracts we can turn to. Everything's already set up. We've gone through it with legal. These are contracts that we can utilize if needed. But also have that trigger, the disaster declaration, whatever it is, however, whatever trigger you need to be able to use the mechanisms that you set up. Uh, when the disaster happens, that's the time to activate them. So document all procurements, expenditures, equipment, materials, and damage relating to the disaster. This is a little bit redundant to the last one, but documentation is huge in any disaster response. And having a plan and executing it during the disaster to collect all the information that you're going to need, not even just for PA, for future audits, for uh, just historical records of the response. That is definitely very essential to financial disaster management. And it and it's extremely difficult to do retroactively. So doing it in the initial post-disaster phase is a million times better than trying to go back and piece things together later. So longer-term post-disaster activities. So document the use of mutual aid and volunteer recovery programs. So this is people basically helping you out with the recovery, but not responding to the disaster itself. Mutual aid can be a little bit difficult to track because it's not as simple as somebody sending you a bill and you paying it. So having a system in place for tracking volunteer hours and things like that, and just doing that is very helpful. So continuing the documentation process. It doesn't end when we demobilize on the finance side. Finance keeps going and the documentation keeps coming in. So identify leads for each project. This is one where, and for the emergency managers on the call, I'm sure, similar to the components of a financial disaster management team, it's probably it might be kind of assumed that you're going to do all of these things in the event of a disaster. Um, Span of control is a big factor in recovery. You can have a lot of different PWs open at the same time. And if it's just one person trying to manage all of those, it can get very hectic. And so the recommendation in the guide that we're talking about is for each project to have identified leads. So engage legal counsel for contracts and procurement compliance. So legal counsel, COVID was one of the first times that the state has really heavily engaged with legal counsel in like during the disaster as well as after the disaster, looking at contracts. Well, actually, I guess the incident is still open. So I guess the better way to say that would be for an extended amount of time. And they've been a huge component. We'll get a lot of times at DEM, we'll get questions about local procurement policies and the I don't not necessarily the legality, but the acceptability of those for public assistance reimbursement. We are not equipped to speak on most of those. Most of those are going to be a decision locally. And that's where you want to bring in your legal counsel to review your contract, make sure everything that you're doing and carrying out, um, they agree with how it's being done and are confident that it will be allowable for whatever federal reimbursement is available. In addition to this, so the next bullet ties into this. So reevaluate emergency procurement and expense authorization limits. This is one that I'm sure many of you have heard a lot, because in procurement during a disaster, for the federal procurement requirements, there's a window where they feel emergency procurements and specifically emergency contracting is allowable, which is kind of the immediate need. After you're outside of that immediate need and the ability to go out for the normal contracting process it becomes possible again, then is a good time to basically go back and look at, okay, this contract was put in place under emergency procurement because we didn't have time back then, but we're going to need this contract going forward. So now we need to put it out for the normal procurement process. And during the long-term post-disaster activities, that's one of the things that you'll be doing, and a very important one for ongoing reimbursement. So that was a very quick summary of the things that are in this disaster financial management guide. This link will be on the YouTube video. You can also just Google disaster financial management guide. It's a guide prepared by FEMA. It's a very useful guide in helping you think of things that you might not have thought of otherwise. Considerations, they have scenarios that will walk you through how would your agency handle the financial disaster management in this scenario. I also added the procurement guidance because I touched on that a couple of times. That's the FEMA procurement guidance. And then a cost estimating tool. And I know there probably aren't many accountants on here, but as you share this with your future financial management or existing financial disaster management teams, there is a template that FEMA's put together that's been very helpful in tracking, projecting, just anything to do with costs. So that's just a picture of the disaster financial management guide. I needed an end slide. This is a very short presentation, mainly because there's a lot of different things that we could dive into on this. So I believe up next is questions. Is that right, Jeff?
That's right. Anybody have questions with this very quick presentation? Which is good though. I know. You did great. Any questions? So as Tanner said, we'll put those links in the description on the YouTube video. That way you can get to them easy. Anything else, Tanner?
I guess just final note, like this has been a very trying year and a half, 2 years, and I'm very happy for all of the steps that we did take in preparing for disaster financial management. But this definitely showed a lot of areas where we need additional practices and considerations to make things a lot easier. One example is with the scope of COVID and the involvement of so many different agencies. One thing that we ran into was that we actually needed to coordinate cost tracking mechanisms better statewide, not just within DEM, because we went through 3 different cost tracking methods during the response to COVID. And because of that, now what would have been a very useful tool, a useful summary of all of our expenses, is split between 3 different cost classifications and is not nearly as useful as it could have been. And then on the contracting side, and just the after the fact kind of stuff, the trying to do things retroactively, a little bit of time and a little bit of kind of forethought into, oh, this might come up in the future. We should keep all of these things together. That's been a very big thing that we are now planning basically a more robust system for, with our emergency procurements accompanying a memo, and those emergency procurement memos being attached with whatever contract documentation or procurement documentation, pre-approvals, things like that. and just keeping all of those things together rather than have to trace them back to the mission, associate the expenses with the mission retroactively, and do everything after the fact. Um, Having a plan in place where you can collect everything you're going to need for the future will make right now a lot easier.
So Tanner, thank you for your presentation. As a reminder to all, this webinar and all the other webinars in this series will be available on the DEM website at dem.utah.gov/exercises, or now at dem.utah.gov/iwonder. Our webinar next week will be on EMAC, and it will be presented by Leah Crumpelman. As always, if you have any I Wonder topic suggestions, please reach out to Tracy Bodley at tbodley@utah.gov to have your topics added to our calendar. We are always excited to help you explore and get to know all that DEM can offer the emergency management community. And so until next time, keep wondering.